Chapter 1 of Windsor Castle, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Perard. Windsor Castle, Book 3, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Chapter 1, comprising the first two epochs in the history of Windsor Castle. Amid the gloom hovering over the early history of Windsor Castle appeared the mighty phantoms of the renowned King Arthur and his knights, for whom it is said Merlin reared a magic fortress upon its heights, in a great hall whereof, decorated with trophies of war and of the chase, was placed the famous Round Table. But if the antique tale is now worn out, and no longer part of our faith, it is pleasant at least to record it, and surrendering ourselves for a while to the sway of fancy, to conjure up the old enchanted castle on the hill, to people its courts with warlike and lovely forms, its forests with fays and giants. Windsor, or Windleshore, so called from the winding banks of the river flowing past it, was the abode of the ancient Saxon monarchs, and a legend is related by William of Malmesbury of a woodman named Wulwen, who, being stricken with blindness, and having visited 87 churches and vainly implored their tutelary saints for relief, was at last restored to sight by the touch of Edward the Confessor, who further enhanced the boon by making him keeper of his palace at Windsor. But though this story may be doubted, it is certain that the pious king above mentioned granted Windsor to the abbot and monks of St. Peter at Westminster, "for the hope of eternal reward, the remission of his sins, the sins of his father, mother, and all his ancestors, and to the praise of Almighty God, as a perpetual endowment and inheritance." But the royal donation did not long remain in the hands of the priesthood. Struck by the extreme beauty of the spot, "for that it seemed exceeding profitable and commodious, because situate so near the Thames, the wood fit for game, and many other particulars lying there, meet and necessary for kings, yea, a place very convenient for his reception," William the Conqueror prevailed upon Abbot Edwin to accept in exchange for it Wakendune and Firlings in Essex, together with 3 other tenements in Colchester; and having obtained possession of the coveted hill, he forthwith began to erect a castle upon it, occupying a space of about half a hide of land. Around it he formed large parks, to enable him to pursue his favourite pastime of hunting, and he enacted and enforced severe laws for the preservation of the game. As devoted to the chase as his father, William Rufus frequently hunted in the forests of Windsor, and solemnized some of the festivals of the church in the castle. In the succeeding reign, namely that of Henry I, the castle was entirely rebuilt and greatly enlarged, assuming somewhat of the character of a palatial residence, having before been little more than a strong hunting seat. The structure then erected in all probability occupied the same site as the upper and lower wards of the present pile, but nothing remains of it except perhaps the keep, and of that little beyond its form and position. In 1109 Henry celebrated the feast of Pentecost with great state and magnificence within the castle. In 1122 he there espoused his second wife, Adelicia, daughter of Godfrey, Duke of Louvaine, and failing in obtaining issue by her, assembled the barons at Windsor, and causing them, together with David, King of Scotland, his sister Adela, and her son Stephen, afterwards King of England, to do homage to his daughter Maud, widow of the Emperor Henry V. Proof that Windsor Castle was regarded as the second fortress in the realm is afforded by the treaty of peace between the usurper Stephen and the Empress Maud, in which it is coupled with the Tower of London under the designation of Motte de Windsor. At the signing of the treaty it was committed to the custody of Richard de Lucy, who was continued in the office of keeper by Henry II. In the reign of this monarch many repairs were made in the castle, to which a vineyard was attached, the cultivation of the grape being at this time extensively practised throughout England. Strange as the circumstance may now appear, Stowe mentions that vines grew in abundance in the home park in the reign of Richard II, the wine made from them being consumed at the king's table and even sold. It is related by Fabian that Henry, stung by the disobedience and ingratitude of his sons, caused an allegorical picture to be painted representing an old eagle assailed by four young ones, which he placed in one of the chambers of the castle. When asked the meaning of the device, he replied, "I am the old eagle, and the four eaglets are my sons, who cease not to pursue my death. The youngest bird, who is tearing out its parent's eyes, is my son John, my youngest and best loved son, and who yet is the most eager for my destruction." On his departure for the Holy Wars, Richard Coeur de Lion entrusted the government of the castle to Hugh de Pudsey, Bishop of Durham and Earl of Northumberland. But a fierce dispute arising between the warrior prelate and his ambitious colleague, William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, he was seized and imprisoned by the latter and compelled to surrender the castle. After an extraordinary display of ostentation, Longchamp was ousted in his turn. On the arrival of the news of Richard's capture and imprisonment in Austria, the castle was seized by Prince John, but it was soon afterwards taken possession of in the king's behalf by the barons, and consigned to the custody of Eleanor, the Queen Dowager. In John's reign the castle became the scene of a foul and terrible event, William de Braouse, a powerful baron, having offended the king. His wife Maud was ordered to deliver up her son a hostage for her husband, but instead of complying with the injunction, she rashly returned for answer, "that she would not entrust her child to the person who could slay his own nephew." Upon which the ruthless king seized her and her son, and, enclosing them in a recess in the wall of the castle, built them up within it. Sorely pressed by the barons in 1215, John sought refuge within the castle, and in the same year signed the two charters, Magna Carta and Carta de Foresta, at Runnymede, a plain between Windsor and Staines. A curious account of his frantic demeanour after divesting himself of so much power and extending so greatly the liberties of the subject, is given by Holinshed. "Having acted so far contrary to his mind, the king was right sorrowful in heart, cursed his mother that bare him, and the hour in which he was born, wishing that he had received death by violence of sword or knife instead of natural nourishment. He whetted his teeth, and did bite now on one staff, now on another, as he walked, and oft brake the same in pieces when he had done. And with such disordered behaviour and furious gestures he uttered his grief, that the nobleman very well perceived the inclination of his inward affection concerning these things before the breaking up of the council, and therefore sore lamented the state of the realm, guessing what would follow of his impatience and displeasant taking of the matter." The faithless king made an attempt to regain his lost power, and war breaking out afresh in the following year, a numerous army under the command of William de Nivernois besieged the castle, which was stoutly defended by Engelhard de Achie and 60 knights. The barons, however, learning that John was marching through Norfolk and Suffolk and ravaging the country, hastily raised the siege and advanced to meet him. But he avoided them, marched to Stamford and Lincoln, and from thence towards Wales. On his return from this expedition he was seized with a distemper, of which he died. Henry III. was an ardent encourager of architecture, and his reign marks the second great epoch in the annals of the castle. In 1223, 800 marks were paid to Engelhard de Sigony, constable of the castle, John le Draper, and William the clerk of Windsor, masters of the works, and others, for repairs and works within the castle. The latter, it is conjectured, referring to the erection of a new great hall within the lower ward, there being already a hall of small dimensions in the upper court. The windows of the new building were filled with painted glass, and at the upper end, upon a raised dais, was a gilt throne sustaining a statue of the king in his robes. Within this vast and richly decorated chamber, in 1240, on the day of the Nativity, an infinite number of poor persons were collected and fed by the king's command. During the greater part of Henry's long and eventful reign, the works within the castle proceeded with unabated activity. Carpenters were maintained on the royal establishment. The ditch between the hall and the lower ward was repaired. A new kitchen was built. The bridges were repaired with timber procured from the neighbouring forests. Certain breaches in the wall facing the garden were stopped. The fortifications were surveyed, and the battlements repaired. At the same time the Queen's chamber was painted and wainscoted, and iron bars were placed before the windows of Prince Edward's chamber. In 1240, Henry commenced building an apartment for his own use near the wall of the castle, 60 feet long and 28 high, another apartment for the Queen contiguous to it, and a chapel, 70 feet long and 28 feet wide, along the same wall, but with a grassy space between it and the royal apartments. The chapel, as appears from an order to Walter de Grey, Archbishop of York, had a Galilee and a cloister, a lofty wooden roof covered with lead, and a stone turret in front holding 3 or 4 bells. Within side it was made to appear like stonework, with good ceiling and painting, and it contained 4 gilded images. This structure is supposed to have been in existence under the designation of the Old College Church, in the latter part of the reign of Henry VII., by whom it was pulled down to make way for the tomb house. Traces of its architecture have been discovered by diligent antiquarian research in the south ambulatory of the Dean's Cloister, and in the door behind the altar in St. George's Chapel, the latter of which is conceived to have formed the principal entrance to the older structure, and has been described as exhibiting "one of the most beautiful specimens which time and innovation have respected of the elaborate ornamental work of the period." In 1241 Henry commenced operations upon the outworks of the castle, and the 3 towers on the western side of the lower ward, now known as the Curfew, the Garter, and the Salisbury towers, were erected by him. He also continued the walls along the south side of the lower ward, traces of the architecture of the period being discoverable in the inner walls of the houses of the alms knights as far as the tower now bearing his name. From thence it is concluded that the ramparts ran along the east side of the upper ward, to a tower occupying the site of the Wican or Winchester Tower. The three towers at the west end of the lower ward, though much dilapidated, present unquestionable features of the architecture of the 13th century. The lower story of the Curfew Tower, which has been but little altered, consists of a large vaulted chamber, 22 feet wide, with walls of nearly 13 feet in thickness, and having arched recesses terminated by loopholes. The walls are covered with the inscriptions of prisoners who have been confined within it. The Garter Tower, though in a most ruinous condition, exhibits high architectural beauty in its moulded arches and corbelled passages. The Salisbury Tower retains only externally, and on the side towards the town, its original aspect. The remains of a fourth tower are discernible in the Governor of the Almsknights' Tower, and Henry III's Tower, as before observed, completes what remains of the original chain of fortifications. On the 24th of November, 1244, Henry issued a writ enjoining "the clerks of the works at Windsor to work day and night to wainscot the high chamber upon the wall of the castle, near our chapel in the Upper Bailey, so that it may be ready and properly wainscoted on Friday next," the 24th occurring on a Tuesday. Only 2 days were allowed for the task. When we come there, with boards radiated and coloured, so that nothing be found reprehensible in the wainscot, and also to make at each gable of the said chamber one glass window, on the outside of the inner window of each gable, so that when the inner window shall be closed, the glass windows may be seen outside." The following year the works were suspended, but they were afterwards resumed and continued, with few interruptions. The keep was new constructed. A stone bench was fixed in the wall near the grass plot by the King's Chamber. A bridge was thrown across the ditch to the King's Garden, which lay outside the walls. A barbican was erected, to which a portcullis was subsequently attached. The bridges were defined by strong iron chains. The old chambers in the upper ward were renovated. A conduit and lavatory were added, and a fountain was constructed in the garden. In this reign, in all probability, the Norman Tower, which now forms a gateway between the middle and the upper ward, was erected. This tower, at present allotted to the housekeeper of the castle, Lady Mary Fox, was used as a prison lodging during the civil wars of Charles I's time, and many noble and gallant captives have left mementos of their loyalty and ill fate upon its walls. In 1260 Henry received a visit to Windsor from his daughter Margaret and her husband Alexander III, King of Scotland. The Queen gave birth to a daughter during her stay at the castle. In 1264, during the contest between Henry and the barons, the valiant Prince Edward, his son, returning from a successful expedition into Wales, surprised the citizens of London, and carrying off their military chest, in which was much treasure, retired to Windsor Castle and strongly garrisoned it. The Queen Eleanor, his mother, would fain have joined him there, but she was driven back by the citizens at London Bridge, and compelled to take sanctuary in the palace of the Bishop of London, at St. Paul's. Compelled at length to surrender the castle to the barons, and to depart from it with his consort, Eleanor of Castile, the brave prince soon afterwards recovered it, but was again forced to deliver it up to Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who appointed Geoffrey de Langeais governor. But though frequently wrested from him at this period, Windsor Castle was never long out of Henry's possession, and in 1265 the chief citizens of London were imprisoned till they had paid the heavy fine imposed upon them for their adherence to Simon de Montfort, who had been just before slain at the battle of Evesham. During this reign a terrific storm of wind and thunder occurred, which tore up several great trees in the park, shook the castle, and blew down a part of the building in which the Queen and her family were lodged, but happily without doing them injury. Four of the children of Edward I, who was blessed with a numerous offspring, were born at Windsor, and as he frequently resided at the castle, the town began to increase in importance and consideration. By a charter granted in 1276 it was created a free borough, and various privileges were conferred on its inhabitants. Stowe tells us that in 1295, on the last day of February, there suddenly arose such a fire in the castle of Windsor that many offices were therewith consumed, and many goodly images, made to beautify the buildings, defaced and deformed. Edward II and his beautiful but perfidious Queen, Isabella of France, made Windsor Castle their frequent abode, and here, on the 13th day of November 1312, at 40 minutes past 5 in the morning, was born a prince, over whose nativity the wizard Merlin must have presided. Baptized within the old chapel by the name of Edward, this prince became afterwards the third monarch of the name, and the greatest, and was also styled from the place of his birth Edward of Windsor. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Windsor Castle, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Windsor Castle, Book 3, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Chapter 2. Comprising the third great epoch in the history of the castle, and showing how the most noble order of the Garter was instituted. Strongly attached to the place of his birth, Edward III, by his letters patent dated from Westminster, in the 22nd year of his reign, now founded the ancient chapel established by Henry I, and dedicated it to the Virgin, St. George of Cappadocia, and St. Edward the Confessor, ordaining that to the 8 canons appointed by his predecessor there should be added 1 custos, 15 more canons, and 24 alms knights, the whole to be maintained out of the revenues with which the chapel was to be endowed. The institution was confirmed by Pope Clement VI, by a bull issued at Avignon the 13th of November, 1351. In 1349, before the foundation of the college had been confirmed, as above related, Edward instituted the Order of the Garter. The origin of this illustrious order has been much disputed. By some writers it has been ascribed to Richard Coeur de Lion, who is said to have girded a leathern band round the legs of his bravest knights in Palestine. By others it has been asserted that it arose from the word Garter having been used as a watchword by Edward at the battle of Crecy. Others again have stoutly maintained that its ring-like form bore mysterious reference to the Round Table. But the popular legend, to which, despite the doubts thrown upon it, credence still attaches, declares its origin to be as follows. Joan, Countess of Salisbury, a beautiful dame, of whom Edward was enamoured, while dancing at a high festival accidentally slipped her garter, of blue embroidered velvet. It was picked up by her royal partner, who, noticing the significant looks of his courtiers on the occasion, used the words to them which afterwards became the motto of the order, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," adding that in a short time they should see that Garter advanced to so high honour and estimation as to account themselves happy to wear it. But whatever may have originated the order, it unquestionably owes its establishment to motives of policy. Wise as valiant, and bent upon prosecuting his claim to the crown of France, Edward, as a means of accomplishing his object, resolved to collect beneath his standard the best knights in Europe, and to lend a color to the design. He gave forth that he intended a restoration of King Arthur's Round Table, and accordingly commenced constructing within the castle a large circular building of 200 feet in diameter, in which he placed a round table. On the completion of the work, he issued proclamations throughout England, Scotland, France, Burgundy, Flanders, Brabant, and the Empire, inviting all knights desirous of approving their valor to a solemn feast and jousts to be holden within the castle of Windsor on St. George's Day, 1345. The scheme was completely successful. The flower of the chivalry of Europe, excepting that of Philip VI. of France, who, seeing through the design, interdicted the attendance of his knights, were present at the tournament, which was graced by Edward and his chief nobles, together with his queen and 300 of her fairest dames, adorned with all imaginable gallantry. At this chivalrous convocation the institution of the Order of the Garter was arranged. But before its final establishment Edward assembled his principal barons and knights, to determine upon the regulations, when it was decided that the number should be limited to 26. The first installation took place on the anniversary of St. George, the patron of the order, 1349, when the king, accompanied by the 25 knights companions, attired in gowns of russet, with mantles of fine blue woolen cloth, powdered, with garters, and bearing the other insignia of the order, marched bareheaded in solemn procession to the chapel of St. George, then recently rebuilt, where mass was performed by William Eddington, Bishop of Winchester, after which they partook of a magnificent banquet. The festivities were continued for several days. At the jousts held on this occasion, David, King of Scotland, the Lord Charles of Blois, and Ralph, Earl of Eu and Guisnes, and Constable of France, to whom the chief prize of the day was adjudged, with others, then prisoners, attended. The harness of the King of Scotland, embroidered with a pale of red velvet, and beneath it a red rose, was provided at Edward's own charge. This suit of armour was, until a few years back, preserved in the Round Tower, where the royal prisoner was confined. Edward's device was a white swan, gorged, or, with the "daring and inviting" motto, "Hey, hey, the white swan, by God's soul I am thy man." The insignia of the order in the days of its founder were the garter, mantle, surcoat, and hood, the George and collar being added by Henry VIII. The mantle, as before intimated, was originally of fine blue woolen cloth; but velvet, lined with taffeta, was substituted by Henry VI., the left shoulder being adorned with the arms of St. George, embroidered within a garter. Little is known of the materials of which the early garter was composed; but it is supposed to have been adorned with gold, and fastened with a buckle of the same metal. The modern garter is of blue velvet, bordered with gold wire, and embroidered with the motto, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." It is worn on the left leg, a little below the knee. The most magnificent garter that ever graced a sovereign was that presented to Charles I. by Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, each letter in the motto of which was composed of diamonds. The collar is formed of pieces of gold fashioned like garters, with a blue enamelled ground. The letters of the motto are in gold, with a rose enamelled red in the centre of each garter. From the collar hangs the George, an ornament enriched with precious stones, and displaying the figure of the saint encountering the dragon. The officers of the order are the prelate, represented by the Bishop of Winchester; the chancellor, by the Bishop of Oxford; the registrar, Dean, Garter King at Arms, and the Usher of the Black Rod. Among the foreign potentates who have been invested with the order are 8 emperors of Germany, 2 of Russia, 5 kings of France, 3 of Spain, 1 of Aragon, 7 of Portugal, 1 of Poland, 2 of Sweden, 6 of Denmark, 2 of Naples, 1 of Sicily and Jerusalem, 1 of Bohemia, 2 of Scotland, 7 princes of Orange, and many of the most illustrious personages of different ages in Europe. Truly hath the learned Selden written, that the order of the Garter hath not only precedency of antiquity before the eldest rank of honor of that kind anywhere established, but it exceeds in majesty, honor, and fame all chivalrous orders in the world. Well also hath glorious Dryden, in the "Flower and Leaf," sung the praises of the illustrious institution. Behold an order yet of newer date, doubling their number, equal in their state, are England's ornament, the crown's defence; in battle brave, protectors of their prince; unchanged by fortune, to their sovereign true, for which their manly legs are bound in blue; these of the Garter called, of faith unstained, in fighting fields the laurel have obtained, and well repaid the laurels which they gained. In 1357 John, King of France, defeated at the battle of Poitiers by Edward the Black Prince, was brought captive to Windsor; and on the festival of St. George in the following year, 1358, Edward outshone all his former splendid doings by a tournament which he gave in honor of his royal prisoner. Proclamations having been made as before, and letters of safe conduct issued, the nobles and knighthood of Almaine, Gascon, Scotland, and other countries, flocked to attend it. The Queen of Scotland, Edward's sister, was present at the jousts; and it is said that John, commenting upon the splendor of the spectacle, shrewdly observed that he never saw or knew such royal shows and feastings without some after reckoning. The same monarch replied to his kingly captor, who sought to rouse him from dejection, on another occasion: "Quomodo cantabimus canticum in terra aliena." That his works might not be retarded for want of hands, Edward in the 24th year of his reign appointed John de Sponley master of the stone hewers, with a power not only to take and keep, as well within the liberties as without, as many masons and other artificers as were necessary, and to convey them to Windsor, but to arrest and imprison such as should disobey or refuse; with a command to all sheriffs, mayors, bailiffs, etc., to assist him. These powers were fully acted upon at a later period, when some of the workmen, having left their employment, were thrown into Newgate; while the place of others, who had been carried off by a pestilence then raging in the castle, was supplied by impressment. In 1356 William of Wykeham was constituted superintendent of the works, with the same powers as John de Sponley, and his appointment marks an important era in the annals of the castle. Originally secretary to Edward III., this remarkable man became Bishop of Winchester and prelate of the Garter. When he solicited the bishopric, it is said that Edward told him he was neither a priest nor a scholar; to which he replied that he would soon be the one, and in regard to the other, he would make more scholars than all the bishops of England ever did. He made good his word by founding the collegiate school at Winchester, and erecting New College at Oxford. When the Winchester Tower was finished, he caused the words, "Hoc fecit Wykeham," to be carved upon it; and the king, offended at his presumption, Wykeham turned away his displeasure by declaring that the inscription meant that the castle had made him, and not that he had made the castle. It is a curious coincidence that this tower, after a lapse of 4 centuries and a half, should become the residence of an architect possessing the genius of Wykeham, and who, like him, had rebuilt the kingly edifice Sir Geoffrey Wyatville. William of Wykeham retired from office, loaded with honors, in 1362, and was succeeded by William de Mulso. He was interred in the cathedral at Winchester. His arms were argent, 2 chevrons, sable, between 3 roses, gules, with the motto, "Manners maketh man." In 1359 Holinshed relates that the king "set workmen in hand to take down much old buildings belonging to the castle, and caused divers other fine and sumptuous works to be set up in and about the same castle, so that almost all the masons and carpenters that were of any account in the land were sent for and employed about the same works." The old buildings here referred to were probably the remains of the palace and keep of Henry I. in the Middle Ward. As the original chapel dedicated to St. George was demolished by Edward IV., its position and form cannot be clearly determined. But a conjecture has been hazarded that it occupied the same ground as the choir of the present chapel, and extended farther eastward. "Upon the question of its style," says Mr. Poynter, from whose valuable account of the castle much information has been derived, "there is the evidence of 2 fragments discovered near this site, a corbel and a piscina, ornamented with foliage strongly characteristic of the decorated English Gothic, and indicating, by the remains of color on their surfaces, that they belonged to an edifice adorned in the polychromatic style, so elaborately developed in the chapel already built by Edward III. at Westminster. The royal lodgings, St. George's Hall, the buildings on the east and north sides of the upper ward, the round tower, the canons' houses in the lower ward, and the whole circumference of the castle, exclusive of the towers erected in Henry III's reign, were now built. Among the earlier works in Edward's reign is the Dean's Cloister. The square of the upper ward, added by this monarch, occupied a space of 420 feet, and encroached somewhat upon the middle ward. Externally the walls presented a grim, rectangular appearance, broken only by the buttresses, and offering no other apertures than the narrow loopholes and gateways. Some traces of the architecture of the period may still be discerned in the archway and machecoulis of the principal gateway adjoining the round tower; the basement chamber of the Devil Tower, or Edward III's Tower; and in the range of groined and 4-centred vaulting, extending along the north side of the upper quadrangle, from the kitchen gateway to King John's Tower. In 1359 Queen Philippa, consort of Edward III., breathed her last in Windsor Castle. Richard II., grandson of Edward III., frequently kept his court at Windsor. Here, in 1382, it was determined by council that war should be declared against France; and here, 16 years later, on a scaffold erected within the castle, the famous appeal for high treason was made by Henry of Lancaster, Duke of Hereford, against Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, the latter of whom defied his accuser to mortal combat. The duel was stopped by the king, and the adversaries banished; but the Duke of Lancaster afterwards returned to depose his banisher. About the same time, the citizens of London having refused Richard a large loan, he summoned the lord mayor, sheriffs, aldermen, and 24 of the principal citizens, to his presence, and after rating them soundly, ordered them all into custody, imprisoning the lord mayor in the castle. In this reign Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, was appointed clerk to the works of St. George's Chapel, at a salary of 2 shillings per day, a sum equal to £657 per annum of modern money, with the same arbitrary power as had been granted to previous surveyors to impress carpenters and masons. Chaucer did not retain his appointment more than 20 months, and was succeeded by John Gedney. It was at Windsor that Henry IV., scarcely assured of the crown he had seized, received intelligence of a conspiracy against his life from the traitorous Aumerle, who purchased his own safety at the expense of his confederates. A timely warning enabled the king to baffle the design. It was in Windsor also that the children of Mortimer, Earl of March, the rightful successor to the throne, were detained as hostages for their father. Liberated by the Countess Dowager of Gloucester, who contrived to open their prison door with false keys, the youthful captives escaped to the marshes of Wales, where, however, they were overtaken by the emissaries of Henry, and brought back to their former place of confinement. A few years later another illustrious prisoner was brought to Windsor, namely, Prince James, the son of King Robert III., and afterwards James I. of Scotland. This prince remained a captive for upwards of 18 years, not being released till 1424, in the second of Henry VI., by the Duke of Bedford, then regent. James's captivity, and his love for Jane of Beaufort, daughter of the Duke of Somerset, and granddaughter to John of Gaunt, to whom he was united, have breathed a charm over the Round Tower, where he was confined; and his memory, like that of the chivalrous and poetical Surrey, whom he resembled in character and accomplishments, will be ever associated with it. In the "King's Quair," the royal poet has left an exquisite picture of a garden nook, contrived within the dry moat of the dungeon. Now was there made, fast by the tower's wall, a garden fair and in the corners set, an arbour green with wandis long and small, railed about, and so with leaves beset, was all the place, and hawthorn hedges net, that life was none, walking there forby, that might within scarce any wight espy. So thick the branches and the leaves green, beshaded all the alleys that there were, and midst of every harbour might be seen, the sharp, green, sweet juniper, growing so fair with branches here and there, that as it seemed to a life without, the boughs did spread the arbour all about. And he thus describes the first appearance of the lovely Jane, and the effect produced upon him by her charms. And therewith cast I down my eye again, whereas I saw walking under the tower, full secretly, new comen her to plain, the fairest and the freshest young flower, that e'er I saw, methought, before that hour. For which sudden abate, anon did start, the blood of all my body to my heart. Henry V. occasionally kept his court at Windsor, and in 1416 entertained with great magnificence the Emperor Sigismund, who brought with him an invaluable relic, the heart of Saint George, which he bestowed upon the chapter. The emperor was at the same time invested with the order. In 1421 the unfortunate Henry VI. was born within the castle, and in 1484 he was interred within it. End of Section 2. Chapter 3 of Windsor Castle, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Windsor Castle, Book 3, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Chapter 3. Comprising the fourth epoch in the history of the castle, and showing how St. George's Chapel was rebuilt by King Edward IV. Finding the foundation and walls of St. George's Chapel much dilapidated and decayed, Edward IV. resolved to pull down the pile, and build a larger and statelier structure in its place. With this view, he constituted Richard Beauchamp, Bishop of Salisbury, surveyor of the works, from whose designs arose the present beautiful edifice. To enable the bishop to accomplish the work, power was given him to remove all obstructions, and to enlarge the space by the demolition of the three buildings then commonly called Clewer's Tower, Burner's Tower, and the Almoner's Tower. The zeal and assiduity with which Beauchamp prosecuted his task is adverted to in the patent of his appointment to the office of Chancellor of the Garter, the preamble whereof recites, that out of mere love towards the order, he had given himself the leisure daily to attend the advancement and progress of this goodly fabric. The chapel, however, was not completed in one reign, or by one architect. Sir Reginald Bray, prime minister of Henry VII., succeeded Bishop Beauchamp as surveyor of the works, and it was by him that the matchless roof of the choir and other parts of the fabric were built. Indeed, the frequent appearance of Bray's arms, sometimes single, sometimes impaling his alliances, in many parts of the ceiling and windows, has led to the supposition that he himself contributed largely to the expense of the work. The groined ceiling of the chapel was not commenced till the 27th year of the reign of Henry VII., when the pinnacles of the roof were decorated with vanes, supported by gilt figures of lions, antelopes, greyhounds, and dragons, the want of which is still a detriment to the external beauty of the structure. The main vaulting of St. George's Chapel, says Mr. Poynter, is perhaps, without exception, the most beautiful specimen of the Gothic stone roof in existence; but it has been very improperly classed with those of the same architectural period in the chapels of King's College, Cambridge, and Henry VII. At Westminster. The roofing of the aisle and the centre compartment of the body of the building are indeed in that style, but the vault of the nave and choir differ essentially from fan vaulting, both in drawing and construction. It is, in fact, a waggon-headed vault, broken by Welsh groins; that is to say, groins which cut into the main arch below the apex. It is not singular in the principle of its design, but it is unique in its proportions, in which the exact mean seems to be attained between the poverty and monotony of a waggon-headed ceiling and the ungraceful effect of a mere groined roof with a depressed roof or large span; to which may be added, that with a richness of effect scarcely, if at all, inferior to fan tracery, it is free from those abrupt junctions of the lines and other defects of drawing inevitable when the length and breadth of the compartments of fan vaulting differ very much, of which King's College Chapel exhibits some notable instances. Supported by these exquisite ribs and groins, the ceiling is decorated with heraldic insignia, displaying the arms of Edward the Confessor, Edward III., Edward the Black Prince, Henry VI., Edward IV., Henry VII., and Henry VIII., with the arms of England and France quartered, the Holy Cross, the shield or cross of St. George, the rose, portcullis, lion rampant, unicorn, fleur de lis, dragon, and prince's feathers, together with the arms of a multitude of noble families. In the nave are emblazoned the arms of Henry VIII., and of several knights companions, among which are those of Charles V., Francis I., and Ferdinand, Enfant of Spain. The extreme lightness and graceful proportions of the pillars lining the aisles contribute greatly to the effect of this part of the structure. Beautiful, however, as is the body of the chapel, it is not comparable to the choir. Here, and on either side, are ranged the stalls of the knights, formerly 26 in number, but now increased to 32, elaborately carved in black oak, and covered by canopies of the richest tabernacle work, supported by slender pillars. On the pedestals is represented the history of the Saviour, and on the front of the stalls at the west end of the choir is carved the legend of St. George, while on the outside of the upper seat is cut, in old Saxon characters, the 20th Psalm in Latin. On the canopies of the stalls are placed the mantle, helmet, coat, and sword of the knights companions; and above them are hung their emblazoned banners. On the back of each stall are fixed small enamelled plates, graven with the titles of the knights who have occupied it. The ancient stall of the sovereign was removed in 1788, and a new seat erected. The altar was formerly adorned with costly hangings of crimson velvet and gold, but these, together with the consecrated vessels of great value, were seized by order of Parliament in 1642 amid the general plunder of the foundation. The service of the altar was replaced by Charles II. The sovereign's stall is immediately on the right on the entrance to the choir, and the prince's on the left. The queen's closet is on the north side above the altar. Beneath it is the beautiful and elaborately wrought framework of iron, representing a pair of gates between two Gothic towers, designed as a screen to the tomb of Edward IV, and which, though popularly attributed to Quintin Matsus, has with more justice been assigned to Master John Tressilian. One great blemish to the chapel exists in the window over the altar, the mullions and tracery of which have been removed to make way for dull colourless copies in painted glass of West's designs. Instead of "blushing with the blood of kings, and twilight saints, and dim emblazonings," steeping the altar in rich suffusion, chequering the walls and pavement with variegated hues, and filling the whole sacred spot with a warm and congenial glow, these paints produce a cold, cheerless, and most disagreeable effect. The removal of this objectionable feature, and the restoration of framework and compartments in the style of the original, and enriched with ancient mellow-toned and many-hued glass in keeping with the place, are absolutely indispensable to the completeness and unity of character of the chapel. Two clerestory windows at the east end of the choir, adjoining the larger window, have been recently filled with stained glass in much better taste. The objections above made may be urged with equal force against the east and west windows of the south aisle of the body of the fane, and the west window of the north aisle. The glorious west window, composed of 80 compartments, embellished with figures of kings, patriarchs, and bishops, together with the insignia of the garter and the arms of the prelates; the wreck gathered from all the other windows; and streaming with the radiance of the setting sun upon the broad nave and graceful pillars of the aisles; this superb window, an admirable specimen of the architecture of the age in which it was designed, had well nigh shared the fate of the others, and was only preserved from desecration by the circumstance of the death of the glass painter. The mullions of this window being found much decayed, were carefully and consistently restored during the last year by Mr. Blore, and the ancient stained glass replaced. Not only does St. George's Chapel form a house of prayer and a temple of chivalry, but it is also the burial place of kings. At the east end of the north aisle of the choir is a plain flag, bearing the words, "King Edward IV. and his Queen Elizabeth Woodville." The coat of mail and surcoat, decorated with rubies and precious stones, together with other rich trophies once ornamenting this tomb, were carried off by the parliamentary plunderers. Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, it was thought, slept beside him; but when the royal tomb was opened in 1789, and the two coffins within it examined, the smaller one was found empty. The queen's body was subsequently discovered in a stone coffin by workmen employed in excavating the vault for George III. Edward's coffin was 7 feet long, and contained a perfect skeleton. On the opposite aisle, near the choir door, as already mentioned, rests the ill-fated Henry VI, beneath an arch, sumptuously embellished by Henry VIII, on the keystone of which may still be seen his arms, supported by 2 antelopes connected by a golden chain. Henry's body was removed from Chertsey, where it was first interred, and reburied in 1484, with much solemnity, in this spot. Such was the opinion entertained of his sanctity that miracles were supposed to be wrought upon his tomb, and Henry VII applied to have him canonized, but the demands of the Pope were too exorbitant. The proximity of Henry and Edward in death suggested the following lines to Pope: "Here, o'er the martyred king the marble weeps, and fast beside him once feared Edward sleeps. The grave unites, where e'en the grave finds rest, and mingled here the oppressor and the oppressed. In the royal vault in the choir repose Henry VIII and his third queen Jane Seymour, together with the martyred Charles I." Space only permits the hasty enumeration of the different chapels and chantries adorning this splendid fane. These are Lincoln Chapel, near which Richard Beauchamp, Bishop of Salisbury, is buried; Oxenbridge Chapel; Aldworth Chapel; Bray Chapel, where rests the body of Sir Reginald de Bray, the architect of the pile; Beaufort Chapel, containing sumptuous monuments of the noble family of that name; Rutland Chapel; Hastings Chapel; and Urswick Chapel, in which is now placed the cenotaph of the Princess Charlotte, sculptured by Matthew Wyatt. In a vault near the sovereign's stall lie the remains of the Duke of Gloucester, who died in 1805, and of his Duchess, who died 2 years after him. And near the entrance of the south door is a slab of grey marble, beneath which lies one who in his day filled the highest offices of the realm, and was the brother of a king and the husband of a queen. It is inscribed with the great name of Charles Brandon. At the east end of the north aisle is the chapter house, in which is a portrait and the sword of state of Edward III. Adjoining the chapel on the east stands the royal tomb house. Commenced by Henry VII as a mausoleum, but abandoned for the chapel in Westminster Abbey, this structure was granted by Henry VIII to Wolsey, who, intending it as a place of burial for himself, erected within it a sumptuous monument of black and white marble, with 8 large brazen columns placed around it, and 4 others in the form of candlesticks. At the time of the cardinal's disgrace, when the building reverted to the crown, the monument was far advanced towards completion; the vast sum of 4,280 ducats having been paid to Benedetto, a Florentine sculptor, for work, and nearly £400 for gilding part of it. This tomb was stripped of its ornaments and destroyed by the parliamentary rebels in 1646; but the black marble sarcophagus forming part of it, and intended as a receptacle for Wolsey's own remains, escaped destruction, and now covers the grave of Nelson in a crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. Henry VIII was not interred in this mausoleum, but in St. George's Chapel, as has just been mentioned, and as he himself directed, midway between the state and the high altar. Full instructions were left by him for the erection of a monument which, if it had been completed, would have been truly magnificent. The pavement was to be of oriental stones, with two great steps upon it of the same material. The two pillars of the church between which the tomb was to be set were to be covered with bas reliefs, representing the chief events of the Old Testament, angels with gilt garlands, 14 images of the prophets, the apostles, the evangelists, and the 4 doctors of the church, and at the foot of every image a little child with a basket full of red and white roses enamelled and gilt. Between these pillars, on a basement of white marble, the epitaphs of the king and queen were to be written in letters of gold. On the same basement were to be 2 tombs of black touchstone supporting the images of the king and queen, not as dead, but sleeping, to show, so runs the order, that famous princes leaving behind them great fame do never die. On the right hand, at either corner of the tomb, was to be an angel holding the king's arms, with a great candlestick, and at the opposite corners 2 other angels bearing the queen's arms and candlesticks. Between the 2 black tombs was to rise a high basement, like a sepulchre, surmounted by a statue of the king on horseback, in armour; both figures to be of the whole stature of a goodly man and a large horse. Over this statue was to be a canopy, like a triumphal arch, of white marble, garnished with oriental stones of diverse colours, with the history of Saint John the Baptist wrought in gilt brass upon it, with a crowning group of the Father holding the soul of the king in his right hand and the soul of the queen in his left, and blessing them. The height of the monument was to be 28 feet. The number of statues was to be 134, with 44 bas reliefs. It would be matter of infinite regret that this great design was never executed, if its destruction by the parliamentary plunderers would not in that case have been also matter of certainty. Charles I. intended to fit up this structure as a royal mausoleum, but was diverted from the plan by the outbreak of the Civil War. It was afterwards used as a chapel by James II, and mass was publicly performed in it. The ceiling was painted by Verrio, and the walls highly ornamented; but the decorations were greatly injured by the fury of an anti-Catholic mob, who assailed the building, and destroyed its windows, on the occasion of a banquet given to the Pope's nuncio by the king. In this state it continued till the commencement of the present century, when the exterior was repaired by George III, and a vault, 70 feet in length, 28 in width, and 14 in depth, constructed within it, for the reception of the royal family. Catacombs, formed of massive octangular pillars, and supporting ranges of shelves, line the walls on either side. At the eastern extremity there are 5 niches, and in the middle 12 low tombs. A subterranean passage leads from the vault beneath the choir of St. George's altar to the sepulchre. Within it are deposited the bodies of George III. and Queen Charlotte, the Princesses Amelia and Charlotte, the Dukes of Kent and York, and the last 2 sovereigns, George IV. and William IV. But to return to the reign of Edward IV, from which the desire to bring down the history of St. George's Chapel to the present time has led to the foregoing digression. About the same time that the chapel was built, habitations for the dean and canons were erected on the northeast of the fane, while another range of dwellings for the minor canons was built at its west end, disposed in the form of a fetterlock, one of the badges of Edward IV, and since called the Horseshoe Cloisters. The ambulatory of these cloisters once displayed a fine specimen of the timber architecture of Henry VII's time, when they were repaired, but little of their original character can now be discerned. In 1482 Edward, desirous of advancing his popularity with the citizens of London, invited the lord mayor and aldermen to Windsor, where he feasted them royally, and treated them to the pleasures of the chase, sending them back to their spouses loaded with game. In 1484 Richard III. kept the feast of St. George at Windsor, and the building of the chapel was continued during his reign. The picturesque portion of the castle on the north side of the upper ward, near the Norman gateway, and which is one of the noblest Gothic features of the proud pile, was built by Henry VII., whose name it still bears. The side of this building looking towards the terrace was originally decorated with two rich windows, but one of them has disappeared, and the other has suffered much damage. In 1500 the deanery was rebuilt by Dean Urswick. At the lower end of the court, adjoining the canons' houses behind the horseshoe cloisters, stands the collegiate library, the date of which is uncertain, though it may perhaps be referred to this period. The establishment was enriched in later times by a valuable library, bequeathed to it by the Earl of Ranelagh. In 1506 Windsor was the scene of great festivity, in consequence of the unexpected arrival of Philip, King of Castile, and his queen, who had been driven by stress of weather into Weymouth. The royal visitors remained for several weeks at the castle, during which it continued a scene of revelry, intermixed with the sports of the chase. At the same time Philip was invested with the Order of the Garter, and installed in the chapel of St. George. The great gateway to the lower ward was built in the commencement of the reign of Henry VIII. It is decorated with his arms and devices, the rose, portcullis, and fleur de lis, and with the bearings of Catherine of Aragon. In 1522 Charles V. visited Windsor, and was installed Knight of the Garter. During a period of dissension in the council, Edward VI. was removed for safety to Windsor by the Lord Protector Somerset, and here, at a later period, the youthful monarch received a letter from the council urging the dismissal of Somerset, with which, by the advice of the Archbishop of Canterbury, he complied. In this reign an undertaking to convey water to the castle from Blackmore Park, near Wingfield, a distance of 5 miles, was commenced, though it was not till 1555, in the time of Mary, that the plan was accomplished, when a pipe was brought into the upper ward, and there the water plenteous did rise 13 feet high. In the middle of the court was erected a magnificent fountain, consisting of a canopy raised upon columns, gorgeously decorated with heraldic ornaments, and surmounted by a great vane, with the arms of Philip and Mary impaled upon it, and supported by a lion and an eagle, gilt and painted. The water was discharged by a great dragon, one of the supporters of the Tudor arms, into the cistern beneath, whence it was conveyed by pipes to every part of the castle. Mary held her court at Windsor soon after her union with Philip of Spain. About this period the old habitations of the alms knights on the south side of the lower quadrangle were taken down, and others erected in their stead. Fewer additions were made to Windsor Castle by Elizabeth than might have been expected from her predilection for it as a place of residence. She extended and widened the north terrace, where, when lodging within the castle, she daily took exercise, whatever might be the weather. The terrace at this time, as it is described by Paul Hentzner, and as it appears in Norden's view, was a sort of balcony projecting beyond the scarp of the hill, and supported by great cantilevers of wood. In 1576 the gallery still bearing her name, and lying between Henry VII's buildings and the Norman Tower, was erected by Elizabeth. This portion of the castle had the good fortune to escape the alterations and modifications made in almost every other part of the upper ward after the restoration of Charles II. It now forms the library. A large garden was laid out by the same queen, and a small gateway on Castle Hill built by her, which afterwards became one of the greatest obstructions to the approach, and it was taken down by George IV. Elizabeth often hunted in the parks, and exhibited her skill in archery, which was by no means inconsiderable, at the butts. Her fondness for dramatic performances likewise induced her to erect a stage within the castle, on which plays and interludes were performed. And to her admiration of the character of Falstaff, and her love of the locality, the world is indebted for the "Merry Wives of Windsor." James I. favored Windsor as much as his predecessors; caroused within its halls, and chased the deer in its parks. Christian IV. of Denmark was sumptuously entertained by him at Windsor. In this reign a curious dispute occurred between the king and the dean and chapter respecting the repair of a breach in the wall, which was not brought to issue for 3 years, when, after much argument, it was decided in favor of the clergy. Little was done at Windsor by Charles I. until the 10th year of his reign, when a banqueting house erected by Elizabeth was taken down, and the magnificent fountain constructed by Queen Mary demolished. 2 years afterwards a pyramid or lantern, with a clock, bell, and dial, was ordered to be set up in front of the castle, and a balcony was erected before the room where Henry VI. was born. In the early part of the year 1642 Charles retired to Windsor to shield himself from the insults of the populace, and was followed by a committee of the House of Commons, who prevailed upon him to desist from the prosecution of the impeached members. On the 23rd of October in the same year, Captain Fogg, at the head of a parliamentarian force, demanded the keys of the college treasury, and, not being able to obtain them, forced open the doors, and carried off the whole of the plate. The plunder of the college was completed by Vane, the parliamentary governor of the castle, who seized upon the whole of the furniture and decorations of the choir, rifled the tomb of Edward IV., stripped off all the costly ornament from Wolsey's tomb, defaced the emblazonings over Henry VI.'s grave, broke the rich painted glass of the windows, and wantonly destroyed the exquisite woodwork of the choir. Towards the close of the year 1648 the ill-fated Charles was brought a prisoner to Windsor, where he remained while preparations were made for the execrable tragedy soon afterwards enacted. After the slaughter of the martyr monarch the castle became the prison of the Earl of Norwich, Lord Capel, and the Duke of Hamilton, and other royalists and cavaliers. Cromwell frequently resided within the castle, and often took a moody and distrustful walk upon the terrace. It was during the Protectorate, in 1677, that the ugly buildings appropriated to the naval knights, and standing between the Garter Tower and Chancellor's Tower, were erected by Sir Francis Crane. Chapter 4 of Windsor Castle, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Windsor Castle, Book 3, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Chapter 4. containing the history of the castle from the reign of Charles II. To that of George III., with a few particulars concerning the parks and forest. Windsor Castle. On the Restoration the castle resumed its splendor, and presented a striking contrast to the previous gloomy period. The terrace, with its festive groups, resembled a picture by Watteau, the courts resounded with laughter, and the velvet sod of the home park was as often pressed by the foot of frolic beauty as by that of tripping deer. 17 state apartments were erected by Sir Christopher Wren, under the direction of Sir John Denham. The ceilings were painted by Verrio, and the walls decorated with exquisite carvings by Grinling Gibbons. A grand staircase was added at the same time. Most of the chambers were hung with tapestry, and all adorned with pictures and costly furniture. The addition made to the castle by Charles was part of the north front, then called the Star Building, from the star of the Order of the Garter worked in colours in the front of it, but now denominated the Stuart Building, extending eastward along the terrace from Henry VII's building 170 feet. In 1676 the ditch was filled up, and the terrace carried along the south and east fronts of the castle. Meanwhile the original character of the castle was completely destroyed and Italianized. The beautiful and picturesque irregularities of the walls were removed, the towers shaved off, the windows transformed into commonplace circular-headed apertures. And so the castle remained for more than a century. Edward III's Tower, indifferently called the Earl Marshal's Tower and the Devil Tower, and used as a place of confinement for state prisoners, was now allotted to the Maids of Honor. It was intended by Charles to erect a monument in honor of his martyred father on the site of the tomb house, which he proposed to remove, and £70,000 were voted by Parliament for this purpose. The design, however, was abandoned under the plea that the body could not be found, though it was perfectly well known where it lay. The real motive, probably, was that Charles had already spent the money. In 1680 an equestrian statue of Charles II, executed by Strada, at the expense of Tobias Rustat, formerly housekeeper at Hampton Court, was placed in the centre of the upper ward. It now stands at the lower end of the same court. The sculptures on the pedestal were designed by Grinling Gibbons, and Horace Walpole pleasantly declared that the statue had no other merit than to attract attention to them. In old times a road, forming a narrow irregular avenue, ran through the woods from the foot of the castle to Snow Hill, but this road having been neglected during a long series of years, the branches of the trees and underwood had so much encroached upon it as to render it wholly impassable. A grand avenue, 240 feet wide, was planned by Charles in its place, and the magnificent approach called the Long Walk laid out and planted. The only material incident connected with the castle during the reign of James II has already been related. Windsor was not so much favoured as Hampton Court by William III, though he contemplated alterations within it during the latter part of his life which it may be matter of rejoicing were never accomplished. Queen Anne's operations were chiefly directed towards the parks, in improving which nearly £40,000 were expended. In 1707 the extensive avenue running almost parallel with the Long Walk, and called the Queen's Walk, was planted by her, and 3 years afterwards a carriage road was formed through the Long Walk. A garden was also planted on the north side of the castle. In this reign Sir James Thornhill commenced painting Charles II's staircase with designs from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but did not complete his task till after the accession of George I. This staircase was removed in 1800, to make way for the present Gothic entrance erected by the elder Wyatt. The first two monarchs of the House of Hanover rarely used Windsor as a residence, preferring Hampton Court and Kensington; and even George III. did not actually live in the castle, but in the Queen's Lodge, a large detached building, with no pretension to architectural beauty, which he himself erected opposite the south terrace, at a cost of nearly £44,000. With most praiseworthy zeal, and almost entirely at his own expense, this monarch undertook the restoration of St. George's Chapel. The work was commenced in 1787, occupied 3 years, and was executed by Mr. Emlyn, a local architect. The whole building was repaved, a new altar screen and organ added, and the carving restored. In 1796 Mr. James Wyatt was appointed Surveyor General of the royal buildings, and effected many internal arrangements. Externally he restored Wren's round-headed windows to their original form, and at the same time Gothicised a large portion of the north and south sides of the upper ward. Before proceeding further, a word must be said about the parks. The Home Park, which lies on the east and north sides of the castle, is about 4 miles in circumference, and was enlarged and enclosed with a brick wall by William III. On the east, and nearly on the site of the present sunk garden, a bowling green was laid out by Charles II. Below, on the north, were Queen Anne's Gardens, since whose time the declivity of the hill has been planted with forest trees. At the east angle of the north terrace are the beautiful slopes, with a path skirting the north side of the Home Park and leading through charming plantations in the direction of the Royal Farm and Dairy, the Ranger's Lodge, and the kennel for the Queen's harriers. This park contains many noble trees; and the grove of elms in the southeast, near the spot where the scathed oak assigned to Herne stands, is traditionally asserted to have been a favourite walk of Queen Elizabeth. It still retains her name. The great park is approached by the magnificent avenue called the Long Walk, laid out, as has been stated, by Charles II, and extending to the foot of Snow Hill, the summit of which is crowned by the colossal equestrian statue of George III, by Westmacott. Not far from this point stands Cumberland Lodge, which derives its name from William, Duke of Cumberland, to whom it was granted in 1744. According to Norden's survey, in 1607, this park contained 3050 acres; but when surveyed by George III it was found to consist of 3800 acres, of which 200 were covered with water. At that time the park was overgrown with ferns and rushes, and abounded in bogs and swamps, which in many places were dangerous and almost impassable. It contained about 3000 head of deer in bad condition. The park has since been thoroughly drained, smoothed, and new planted in parts; and 2 farms have been introduced upon it, under the direction of Mr. Kent, at which the Flemish and Norfolk modes of husbandry have been successfully practised. Boasting every variety of forest scenery, and commanding from its knolls and acclivities magnificent views of the castle, the great park is traversed, in all directions, by green drives threading its long vistas, or crossing its open glades, laid out by George IV. Amid the groves at the back of Spring Hill, in a charmingly sequestered situation, stands a small private chapel, built in the Gothic style, and which was used as a place of devotion by George IV. During the progress of the improvements at the castle, and is sometimes attended by the present queen. Not the least of the attractions of the park is Virginia Water, with its bright and beautiful expanse, its cincture of green banks, soft and smooth as velvet, its screen of noble woods, its Chinese fishing temple, its frigates, its ruins, its cascade, cave, and druidical temple, its obelisk and bridges, with numberless beauties besides, which it would be superfluous to describe here. This artificial mere covers pretty nearly the same surface of ground as that occupied by the great lake of olden times. Windsor Forest once comprehended a circumference of 120 miles, and comprised part of Buckinghamshire, a considerable portion of Surrey, and the whole southeast side of Berkshire, as far as Hungerford. On the Surrey side it included Cobham and Chertsey, and extended along the side of the Wey, which marked its limits as far as Guildford. In the reign of James I., when it was surveyed by Norden, its circuit was estimated at 77 miles and a half, exclusive of the liberties extending into Buckinghamshire. There were 15 walks within it, each under the charge of a head keeper, and the whole contained upwards of 3,000 head of deer. It is now almost wholly enclosed. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Windsor Castle, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Windsor Castle, Book 3, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Chapter 5. The last great epoch in the history of the castle. A prince of consummate taste and fine conceptions, George IV. meditated, and, what is better, accomplished the restoration of the castle to more than its original grandeur. He was singularly fortunate in his architect. Sir Geoffrey Wyatville was to him what William of Wykeham had been to Edward III. All the incongruities of successive reigns were removed; all, or nearly all, the injuries inflicted by time repaired; and when the work so well commenced was finished, the structure took its place as the noblest and most majestic palatial residence in existence. To enter into a full detail of Wyatville's achievements is beyond the scope of the present work; but a brief survey may be taken of them. Never was lofty design more fully realized. View the castle on the north, with its grand terrace of nearly 1,000 feet in length, and high embattled walls; its superb façade, comprehending the stately Brunswick Tower; the Cornwall Tower, with its gorgeous window; George IV.'s Tower, including the great oriel window of the state drawing room; the restored Stuart buildings, and those of Henry VII. and of Elizabeth; the renovated Norman Tower; the Powder Tower, with the line of walls as far as the Winchester Tower. View this, and then turn to the east, and behold another front of marvellous beauty extending more than 400 feet from north to south, and displaying the Prince of Wales's Tower, the Chester, Clarence, and Victoria Towers; all of which have been raised above their former level, and enriched by great projecting windows. Behold also the beautiful sunken garden, with its fountain and orangery, its flight of steps, and charming pentagonal terrace. Proceed to the south front, of which the Victoria Tower, with its machicolated battlements and oriel window, forms so superb a feature at the eastern corner, the magnificent gateway receiving its name from George the Fourth, flanked by the York and Lancaster towers, and opening in a continued line from the Long Walk. Look at St. George's Gate, Edward the Third's renovated tower, and the Octagon Tower beyond it. Look at all these, and if they fail to excite a due appreciation of the genius that conceived them, gaze at the triumph of the whole, and which lords over all the rest the Round Tower. Gaze at it, and not here alone, but from the heights of the great park, from the vistas of the Home Park, from the bowers of Eton, the meads of Clewer and Datchet, from the Brocas, the gardens of the naval knights. From 100 points. View it at sunrise when the royal standard is hoisted, or at sunset when it is lowered, near or at a distance, and it will be admitted to be the work of a prodigious architect. But Wyatville's alterations have not yet been fully considered. Pass through St. George's Gateway, and enter the grand quadrangle to which it leads. Let your eye wander round it, beginning with the inner sides of Edward the Third's Tower and George the Fourth's Gateway, and proceeding to the beautiful private entrance to the sovereign's apartments, the grand range of windows of the eastern corridor, the proud towers of the gateway to the household, the tall pointed windows of St. George's Hall, the state entrance tower, with its noble windows, until it finally rests upon the Stuart buildings and King John's Tower, at the angle of the pile. Internally the alterations made by the architects have been of corresponding splendor and importance. Around the south and east sides of the court at which you are gazing, a spacious corridor has been constructed, 550 feet in length, and connected with the different suites of apartments on these sides of the quadrangle. Extensive alterations have been made in the domestic offices. The state apartments have been repaired and rearranged. St. George's Hall has been enlarged by the addition of a private chapel the only questionable change and restored to the Gothic style, and the Waterloo Chamber built to contain George the Fourth's munificent gift to the nation of the splendid collection of portraits now occupying it. The first and most remarkable characteristic of operations of Sir Geoffrey Wyatville on the exterior, observes Mr. Poynter, is the judgment with which he has preserved the castle of Edward the Third. Some additions have been made to it, and with striking effect; as the Brunswick Tower, and the western tower of George the Fourth's gateway which so nobly terminates the approach from the great park. The more modern buildings on the north side have also been assimilated to the rest; but the architect has yielded to no temptation to substitute his own design for that of William of Wykeham, and no small difficulties have been combated and overcome for the sake of preserving the outline of the edifice, and maintaining the towers in their original position. The Winchester Tower, originally inhabited by William of Wykeham, was bestowed upon Sir Geoffrey Wyatville as a residence by George the Fourth, and, on the resignation of the distinguished architect, was continued to him for life by the present queen. The works within the castle were continued during the reign of William the Fourth, and at its close the actual cost of the buildings had reached the sum of £771,000, and it has been asserted that the general expenditure up to the present time has exceeded £1.5 million of money. The view from the summit of the Round Tower is beyond description magnificent, and commands 12 counties, namely, Middlesex, Essex, Hereford, Berks, Bucks, Oxford, Wilts, Hants, Surrey, Sussex, Kent, and Bedford; while on a clear day the dome of St. Paul's may be distinguished from it. This tower was raised 33 feet by Sir Geoffrey Wyatville, crowned with a machicolated battlement, and surmounted with a flag tower. The circumference of the castle is 4180 feet; the length from east to west, 1480 feet; and the area, exclusive of the terraces, about 12 acres. For the present the works are suspended. But it is to be hoped that the design of Sir Geoffrey Wyatville will be fully carried out in the lower ward, by the removal of such houses on the north as would lay St. George's Chapel open to view from this side; by the demolition of the old incongruous buildings lying westward of the bastion near the 100 Steps; by the opening out of the pointed roof of the library; the repair and reconstruction in their original style of the Curfew, the Garter, and the Salisbury Towers; and the erection of a lower terrace extending outside the castle, from the bastion above mentioned to the point of termination of the improvements, and accessible from the town; the construction of which terrace would necessitate the removal of the disfiguring and encroaching houses on the east side of Thames Street. This accomplished, Crane's ugly buildings removed, and the 3 western towers laid open to the court, the horseshoe cloisters consistently repaired, Windsor Castle would indeed be complete. And fervently do we hope that this desirable event may be identified with the reign of Victoria. Chapter 5 Thus ends the third book of the Chronicle of Windsor Castle.